That's right. Sorry about that. Tough to break old habits, isn't it? Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here and an honor to be asked by Loman to be part of your organization here this afternoon. It's good to see so many people. It's good to see people at all, for that matter, as we've been kind of in darkness and seclusion for a while, but not anymore, right? It's nice to be back together, breathing toward each other, eating food together, breaking bread together, and sharing ideas together. And it'll be an honor to be with you throughout the afternoon. Thank you again for joining us. John Tanney is Vice President and Director of FreedomWorks Center for Economic Freedom. John is also editor of Real Clear Markets, a contributor at Forbes, and a senior economic advisor to the mutual fund firm, Applied Science Group. Let's make that Applied Finance Group. The Applied Science Group is Mr. Fauci. Anyway, and don't forget, if you attack him, you're attacking science, so you have to watch that. Anyway, John is the author of 5 books, including Popular Economics, Who Needs the Fed?, The End of Work, They're Both Wrong, and latest, When Politicians Panicked, the New Coronavirus Expert Opinion and a Tragic Lapse of Reason, available on where else? Amazon and anywhere else books are sold. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome this afternoon Mr. John Tanney.
Thank you very much, Gary, for this warm introduction, and thank you so much for all of you being here around other people. How did they ever fall for the absurd notion that the very people who've driven all progress throughout time had become a lethal menace to one another? So thank goodness we're all here. And remember, and I'll begin my talk with some optimism. Let's never forget that a bad day in the United States is an amazing day anywhere else. We are the envy of the world. Let's never forget that what happened in the past 15 months, awful as it was, and it was certainly awful in Pennsylvania. My goodness, your governor must hate you and must hate people in general after what he did. But let's never forget that what we went through is nothing relative to what entrepreneurs and what Americans have gone throughout time. When you think of Nike founder Phil Knight, when you think for the first 18 years of running his business, every night he thought it was going to die the next day. He kept telling his wife, Nike will survive, not believing what he told her. And so this is the norm. Americans go up against high odds all the time, and they always overcome them, and we overcame this. And so let's never forget that we should be optimistic about what's ahead. And then for the young people in the audience, I wish I could be you. I hope you'll keep in touch with me. Your future is amazingly bright. What you'll call jobs will be the kind of work that you can't get enough of, that people will say to you in many instances, they pay you to do that, and look at you with an awe. And so be optimistic about what's ahead, but let's also be honest about what happened over the last 15 to 16 months, because we have to tell this story. What happened was no less than the biggest human rights tragedy of the 21st century. And we must make that case, because if we don't tell our story, if we don't say what actually happened, history books will promote the fiction that a virus caused a global economic contraction. No, the virus had been spreading for months. It had been in the news for months. What happened was that politicians panicked. Governor Wolf panicked and needlessly destroyed all manner of lives, jobs, businesses as a consequence. And so we have to tell this story over and over again, and we must have good arguments, because if we don't have good arguments, this will happen again. And so let's first say that the initial arguments used in favor of the lockdowns were easily the worst of all of them. They first said that, well, we have to take away freedom and destroy businesses and jobs because we have to protect the hospitals. If we let people be free, they will get sick and overrun our hospitals. Who in this room needs to be forced to avoid hospitalization? Yet that was the initial justification they gave. And then they said, well, there's a study from over in England that says 2.3 million Americans will die unless we take away the freedom of the American people. Well, so who in this room would need to be forced to avoid something that might result in death? What if they predicted 30 million American deaths? It's a reminder that the more threatening a virus might be, the more superfluous political force would be. Again, who in this room would need to avoid behavior associated with death? Yet that was the excuse politicians used. We must destroy your livelihoods. We must take away your ability to be around other people. We must wreck the business you spent your life building, because if we don't, you will act in ways that will cause you to die. Have you ever heard something more insulting by the political class, yet they did it? Now, they did this, and in the process, they took away, as we know, economic growth. The result was a crushing economic decline of the most dynamic economy in the world. And so let's think about that in terms of history. And let's remind everyone that economic growth has always been the biggest enemy death and disease have ever known. Conversely, poverty by definition and historically by truth has always been the biggest killer of mankind. Yet when they had a chance, when the virus was spreading, they chose economic desperation. Think about that in terms of history. Think about that in terms of the 19th century. Let's travel back in time then. Back then, if you broke your leg, if you broke your femur, you had 1 in 3 chances of death. But if you lived, your only option was amputation. If you broke your hip, dead. When you were born in the 19th century, you had as good of a chance of dying as you did living. Cancer, forget about it, you were going to die, but see, most people never got cancer. And they didn't because pneumonia and tuberculosis killed all too many first. Cancer was some disease that you got if you lived a fairly long life. If you move into the early 20th century, in 1910, cancer was still a very distant 8th among American killers. Even during World War I, this was the first war in the history of mankind in which more people died from gunshots and bombs than they did from routine disease. And so what changed? Why is all of a sudden were we living so much longer? Well, the basic answer is economic growth. That's the only answer. People like Johns Hopkins, one of the big shareholders in the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, made tons of money, and he gave $7 million to what became Johns Hopkins University. This was the first real medical school in the history of the U.S. And so suddenly doctors and scientists were coming up with ways to fight off that which used to kill us. We could literally die but live once, twice, 3 times, because what used to kill us for certain no longer did, because of economic growth that was matched with doctors and scientists on the way to the discoveries. John D. Rockefeller, the richest man who ever lived, in his lifetime alone gave away $450 million just to medical research out of $530 million total in his lifetime. And so suddenly we were making progress. Suddenly we were living. Economic growth has always been the biggest foe of death and disease, but in 2020, politicians quite literally chose economic contraction, economic desperation as the response to a virus that was spreading. Historians will marvel at the abject stupidity of the political class. But they can only marvel at it if we tell this story, if we make sure that our narrative, which is the true narrative, makes it into the history books. At which point, it's got to be said very clearly that freedom on its own is a virtue. No matter what, freedom is always the answer. Freedom's got to be the first and last response to any question about a virus. But in this case, we didn't choose the freedom route, and we harmed ourselves needlessly. Indeed, we harmed our health. Because think about what happens with free people. The free people, they are the marketplace. And so we know in this instance that a virus was spreading and people were scared. And the point of that is that Americans had already started to adjust to the virus without any political force. As I point out in my book, When Politicians Panicked, in the states that locked down last, the people within those states were starting to make adjustments first. Some were going out to restaurants less, some were going out to bars less. They were adjusting. Some were buying masks, some were buying hand sanitizer. In Germany, while Angela Merkel was still dismissing the idea of a virus altogether, masks and hand sanitizer had already sold out. The point is, people didn't need a law. They didn't need to be forced to avoid something that might make them sick, that might, in very rare instances, cause them to die. We were already adjusting, and all of us know people that were. Think about it. Free people on their own, some of them were locking themselves into their houses, never to be seen again. Well, guess what? You need people like that. Not my choice, but you need people like that. You need to learn from people who run and hide from a virus as though it's just going to go curl up and die and go somewhere else. You need people like that to find out if those actions help you avoid sickness. Well, it turns out it didn't. In New York, 2/3 of those who were hospitalized by May of 2020 had been sheltering in place. You also need people like my very occasionally exasperating wife, who quite literally, every time I would walk in the house, she would say, "Have you washed your hands?" She'd follow me around to make sure I'd washed my hands. We'd be walking down the sidewalk and someone would pass us and she'd jump out into the sidewalk. I was flabbergasted, but you need people like her. You need to find out if that sort of behavior somehow saves you from illness. And then you need people like me, people who were skeptics from the beginning, people like me for whom a trip to the grocery store each day was the highlight of the day, just to be around other people. People like me who would quite literally forget things at the grocery store on purpose so that I could go back and be around people again. You got to have people like me. You need people like my science-denying parents out in Southern California, 80 and 77, who refuse to stop living their lives despite their doctors saying, "Oh my God, never go into a grocery store, don't do anything." You need people like that to find out if you're healthy, if somehow a spreading virus is going to cause you to die or get very sick. And then most of all, you need the young people who are going to throw caution to the wind and go to every bar and every party and make out with every girl and guy they see, because from them you find out information too. Let's be clear that free people, it's not just a virtue that they're free. It's not just a virtue that they create the economic growth, the wealth that makes it possible to fight off what used to kill us. Free people, most of all, produce information. By their varying actions, by 330 million Americans doing different things because that's their right, we find out the actions that are most associated with getting the virus, with becoming sick, with dying, when we needed information most. Politicians in their infinite wisdom blinded us. They took away our freedom and we knew less. Businesses are no different. Think about what they did to the life's work of so many people. They said, "You're no longer essential. What you do is no longer matters. You will just stay home and people can't patronize your business." How interesting there. They said that crowds were the big danger. So their response was to let us go into much fewer businesses and be around more people rather than let businesses choose how to meet our needs. The very governments that gave us the DMV and the post office and the passport office quite literally told businesses how to run themselves. And you think about that in a bigger picture, what that meant. We needed businesses trying different things. Small businesses logically did not have the means to shut down. And then bigger businesses, and there's nothing wrong with them, like Disney, obviously had the access to capital markets to stay open, to shut down for a time. They didn't want to risk their brand. You needed a mix of businesses trying different things, and most of all, you needed the small businesses that politicians needlessly wrecked to teach big businesses how to reopen. What are the ways? What do customers want? Do they want surge pricing? Do they want higher prices at 8 o'clock at restaurants, lower prices at 4 o'clock and 10 o'clock? We weren't able to figure out how to reopen because politicians once again blinded the businesses necessary to make it possible for us to reopen. Everything about this made absolutely no sense. And let's never forget that it never made any sense. When you take away freedom, you take away the answers that make it possible for you to put up a good fight against a virus or anything else. And you think about it in a bigger picture sense. Let's never forget that we live in the greatest country on earth. We live in the country that the world's poorest have been risking their lives for centuries to get to. Not for security. Never for security. Never for security from other threats. They did it because they wanted the chance to taste freedom. They wanted the chance to have economic freedom. Yet the very country that has been a magnet for the world's strivers for all this time literally took away the right of people to go to work, the right of people to operate their businesses. And I think a little bit inside of the world died when they saw that the American people were so willing in some instances to give up their freedom that the rest of the world would give anything to have. And they took it away from us. And they said, okay, your work isn't essential, but we'll give you a check for $1,200 for your troubles. Have you ever heard of something more sick, something more arrogant? The business you spent your life building, that you spent your life building by making people happier, making them better off, suddenly you can't operate it. We'll give you a check for a fraction of the earnings you'll miss out on. You can't operate anymore, but here's some money for your trouble. Most people would never start a business just for the money. There's so much more that goes into it. But a political class that thinks that it is so important, that thinks that its very existence is what keeps us alive, basically said, here's a little money for you. Let's never forget what they did. Let's never forget what they did to the kids. Literally, kids were told you can't be at school. There's so many anecdotes about this. But one of the most hideous ones from where I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, they announced last fall that we're going to keep the public schools closed. And of course, a lot of people in that area were just thrilled. Oh, wait, they're following the science. Isn't that great? And some innocent mother wrote into a listserv and she said, I've got a high school-age daughter who is autistic. Never really fit in. She'd finally gotten into the high school band and had fallen in love with school, and they took it away from her. These are the people who say that they're looking out for your best interest. And you heard the stories about old people in nursing homes. Suddenly, they couldn't be around anyone. People with Alzheimer's, and they were asking questions, did I do something wrong? Why can't I see anyone anymore? This is what the political class did, and let's never let them forget what they did. And let's never forget that we cannot make this a statistical argument when we argue against the human rights tragedy that happened, the human rights tragedy that literally pushed 285 million people around the world to the brink of starvation. Also that a bunch of nail-biting Americans could feel comfortable from a virus so that they could take their break from reality. So we can talk about the statistics, about the CD stats, about how 90% plus of those who died with the virus had some other major morbidity. We can talk about the various ways that support our argument, but I think that's the wrong way to do it. If we win statistically, we win the battle but lose the war because we imply that politicians have the right to take away our right to work, to operate our businesses, to be around other people. It's a losing argument. The only argument to make is freedom, that they should never take away our right to live as we want, that the more something threatens us, the more their force is superfluous. And we need to make this argument because unless it's first and last, middle, and everything else about freedom, know that they will do this again because everyone in this room knows this is not the last virus that's going to hit the United States. Viruses are part of life, despite what a bunch of nail-biting politicians told us. And because they're part of life, we know that in the future, experts will gull weak-kneed, arrogant politicians again into taking away our freedom unless we win the argument on the freedom level. That is the only argument. Anything else ensures other lockdowns again that will needlessly destroy lives and jobs and businesses and just the American way of living. And so let's be clear about this, that what happened was a tragedy. But it was a man-made tragedy born of the political class, left and right. Let's excuse no one. They all had a role in this. And let's never allow this to happen again. We owe this to ourselves. We owe this to future generations. And we owe this to the greatest country the world has ever known, to never let it again be insulted by this notion that in order for us to be safe, we must have our freedom taken from us. Never again. Thank you very much.